There was the same urgency in my voice as there had been on the day of the great flood. Such was my concern for my beloved Sosha. The following morning, July 23rd, Stefan Grableski appeared through our tunnel as if by some final miracle. It was my mother's birthday, whether by great coincidence or a divine hand that had somehow grabbed Beresteiki's dream. We were overjoyed to see our friend who told us of the fighting in the streets of Alv. He had been anxious to escape the bombing, so he sought refuge in the one place he knew the fighting would not find him, the sewer, our sewer. It was like a second home to him, he said. He knew he would be safe with us, he said, and so he came. Wróblewski had not been in contact with Sosha, but he assured us that our friend was safe. Then he offered his account of the fighting. My father and the others tried to place this new information alongside what they already knew and made their own assumptions about the progress of the Russians and the retreat of the Germans. Later that day, with Stefik still in our company, Korzar separated from our group in an effort to gather more information. He crawled through the pipes to an area of the sewer that would allow him to see and hear activity in the streets, and in this way he listened to a group of Russian soldiers assessing their circumstance. He pushed aside a manhole cover so he could see and hear clearly. He concluded that the Russians had indeed captured the city and returned to our group to report this happy discovery. This was indeed good news, but we were cautious in our rejoicing. We knew what had happened in Tarnopol. Wróblewski, too, was wary of the situation. He decided to return to the streets to hopefully locate Sosha and Kawalao and see about our rescue, but he told us to remain in the palace until he returned. We did not wish to be so reckless that our premature celebration would lead to our execution, so we agreed to wait. Tola did not see the point of remaining in the sewer when it was clear to him the Russians controlled the streets. He became enraged. The men were exhausted from keeping our prisoners silent and still. He kept shouting, "Let us go already, enough!" For another few days there was no sign of our sewer workers. This meant that it had been nearly a week since we'd seen Sosha. This was by far the longest stretch of time we'd been without his company since we began our confinement. We were filled with worry, but at the same time we were filled with elation that our liberation would soon be at hand. The two emotions were knitted as one. It was like a birthday gift to my mother, my father remarked, to receive such news on July 23rd. Now we only had to wait to unwrap this present when our sewer workers told us it was safe to do so. And so we waited. There had been no bread or other food deliveries for several days. We were getting by on our stores of coffee, substitute, and sugar, and these too were getting low. We could not remain in this place in such a state of agitation for such an interminate period. Soon our patience would run out along with our resources. We were too excited to think about food, but in time, of course, we would need to eat. At this point, we could hear the Russian voices overhead. Where there had once been the playful shouts and cries of children in the square by the church, there were now the stern commands of Russian officers. More and more we became comfortable with the notion that the Russians were now in charge. More and more we thought of venturing out into the city on our own, without the guidance of our sewer workers. Still, we would wait for Sosha and Wróblewski until we could not. We tried to keep to our routines. We woke each morning and established our sitting area. We washed. We watched as Beresteiki said his morning prayers. We drank a few sips of coffee. The men took their turns guarding Tola in the same 4-hour shifts that had been established on the night of his arrival. Finally, in the early morning hours of July 27th, my father took his turn with Tola while the rest of us tried to sleep. When my father completed his shift, he handed his gun to Korzar's. My father was tired and looking forward to a few hours of sleep before the rest of the day got underway. As he slept, we received the summons for which we had been waiting, praying, dreaming, hoping. Until the end of his long life, my father would say this was his greatest regret, to have slept through the announcement that the tyranny against us had been lifted and that we were free to rejoin the world that had forsaken us so very long ago. For months and months he had imagined this, and when it was at last upon us, he was fast asleep. It was Sosha who came for us. only he did not come through the usual opening. In fact, he did not come into our chamber at all. He came hollering through the sewer grate above our chamber. "Tiger, Tiger," Sosha shouted, "you are going out. The time has come. Your freedom is at hand. Everybody out. You are free. Tiger, Tiger." The words were too beautiful to be believed, but of course we believed them. We were not all awake, but the declaration found us through our sleep, and we awakened soon enough. We ran about our underground chamber in a fit of happiness. Korzars was shaving while he was guarding Tola. My mother was already awake and beginning to prepare for the day. She shook my father to tell him of Sosha's declaration, and he could not believe he had slept through such a moment. In the commotion that followed, I cannot say for certain what happened next. Sosha told us to leave everything behind and to come quickly. This I remember. He told us where to go. Korzars led the way. For some reason, he could not exit through the manhole. We could not exit through the manhole directly over our heads. We crawled and crawled through the wet pipes, through the 40-centimeter pipes, through the 70-centimeter pipes. The 40s, as we called them, were not so difficult as they had been and the way in. We were all so much thinner than we had been a year earlier, and now we had no trouble slipping through these tight spaces. Paul and I just crawled behind Korzars. My mother was at our heels. Behind us came Wybergova, Clara, and Helena, followed by Tola, Berestayke, Orenbach, and finally my father. Never before had a group of 11 individuals crawled so quickly through these narrow pipes. It was not such a long way, but before we knew it, we had climbed a small ladder and had arrived at the manhole opening Sosha had described. We did not know it just yet, but we had reached a small courtyard behind a cluster of apartment buildings where a large crowd had gathered. Korzars climbed through first, and we followed in order. When it was my turn, Sosha reached a hand to lift me from the manhole opening, and with this hand he hoisted me toward him in a great hug. He twirled me about inside this hug, and I was dizzy with emotion. I had to close my eyes to the brightness of the day, and of course this combined with the twirling contributed to my dizziness. I could hear clapping and shouts of congratulations, but I could not open my eyes when I tried to do so. Everything was colored in orange and red. It was like looking through a photographic negative. I could only make out vague shapes, so I closed my eyes and listened to the sounds of our new freedom and imagined what it must look like. Next, Sosha set me down and reached for Paul, whom he also collected in a great hug. This, I was told, because I could not see. Little Paul, he was so scared by all of the excitement and all of the people, he screamed in terror, and Sosha held him close and covered him with hugs and kisses. When my mother climbed through next, Paul raced to her and began tugging on her coat. He shouted, "I want to go back. I want to go back." He'd been so long in the sewer that it had become his entire world. He did not understand all of this noise and commotion. He could not comprehend all of these people, or the open space of the courtyard, or the bright sunshine that seemed to me to wash everything in shades of red and orange. At one point he let go of my mother's coat and attempted to climb back through the manhole opening, until Sosha once again lifted him up and tried to comfort him. Poor Paul had been so young when he descended into the sewer, and he was still so young. For him, it was as if he spent his entire life there. It was the only world he knew. This other world, this above-ground, outside world, was strange and terrifying to him. It was logical that he wanted to go back, but Sosha was able to calm him down after a short time, after which Paul did a remarkable thing. He raced to one of the Russian soldiers who had assembled to greet us and threw himself at the soldier's feet. He began kissing the soldier's muddy boots as if in gratitude. One by one, the members of our underground family climbed through the manhole opening. Each time there would be applause and shouts and astonished cries. We must have looked pitiable, our clothes reduced to rags, our faces worn and hollow, our spines bent and nearly broken, but we were alive. We emerged like cavemen, like some band of primal animals, but we were alive. The people, they could not believe it. Finally, my father's head appeared through the opening, and the shouts and cries seemed louder still. My eyes had not yet adjusted to the daylight, but I could tell this excitement was for my father. I heard people calling his name, "Tiger!" He'd been well known throughout the ghetto before the final liquidation, and probably Sosha had told of his efforts in organizing our underground escape. Then Sosha called out to my father as he stood to his full height for the first time in 14 months and called him the captain of our shipwreck. The two men embraced, and there was once again applause and congratulations all around. I opened my eyes to this and could see their shadowy figures well enough. Tola had been led away from the scene, probably by Wroblewski, so it was now only the 10 of us in the open air of this courtyard. The 10 of us, and Leopold Sosha, our guardian angel. This was our underground family, and we were fairly surrounded by dozens of Russian soldiers and neighborhood residents and local officials and other workers. We stood in the center of a makeshift circle, and Sosha lifted his arms and indicated our group. "These are my Jews," he said proudly. "This is my work." Slowly the onlookers who had gathered to witness our resurrection began to disperse, but not before a few of them came to speak to us, to hear firsthand some of the stories that Sosha had already shared with them, and to share with us some of their own observations. A woman who introduced herself as the superintendent of one of the apartment buildings backing onto this courtyard told us that she had often detected the aroma of soup coming up through the sewer grates just over where we had been sitting. Another woman remarked that during the winter there always seemed to be the thinnest patch of snow near our manhole, as if some had been melted away by the warmth of our bodies below or from the constant flame of our Primus stove. Everywhere else, the snow was piled thick and full, but here in this one spot, it was thin and soft. Soon, the other people disappeared into their own lives, and it was Sosha and the 10 more. In this group, my parents found each other, and they found us children, and we clung to one another, as if the rest of this above-ground world had fallen away. One of the main reasons Sosha had been so long in coming was that he had been making sure the Germans had indeed been put down by the Russians, and that it would be safe for us to walk the streets once more. Another reason was that he wanted to have everything organized for us once we left the sewer. He knew we no longer had any money. He knew we did not have a place to live or any proper clothes to wear. So he set about organizing our lives above ground, just as he had organized our lives underground. We learned this once the crowd of onlookers dispersed. Sosha had worked diligently over the precious few days preparing a new home for us. One of the buildings that had backed onto this courtyard that had been occupied by the Germans during the war, but now that the Russians were in control of the building, it was empty. Sosha had arranged for us to occupy the first floor of this building. He had gathered a full supply of furnishings for us as well. Chairs, tables, beds, and bedding, whatever he could think we might need. We had not thought of these things during our time underground because they were secondary to our survival. But Sosha was clever enough to think of them on our behalf. Such was the depth of his commitment to us that he would make this extra effort even after our survival had been assured. There were 4 rooms on the first floor of the building. Sosha assigned my family to one room. Corsars and Berestiki occupied the second room. Helena Wind and Clara Kahler occupied the third room, and Chase Ornbach and Genia Weinberg occupied the fourth room. Immediately, some of the onlookers took pity on us and brought us food and other necessities. By the light of day, we must have looked frightening. Paul and I especially became the objects of great concern. Our cheeks were pale, our arms and legs as thin as reeds. The hollow beneath our eyes were as deep and empty as a corpse's. Our feet were wrapped in rags and newspapers, since we had no shoes. Even our hair, which we had taken great pains to brush and keep clean, appeared matted and unkempt like a bird's nest under siege. Other adults in our party who had been accustomed to our appearance, we were only Krisha and Polek, the indomitable children of Ignacy and Paulina, but to these strangers we were an unbelievable sight. One kind lady brought us a jar of honey, which Paul and I devoured like hungry bear cubs. This woman was astonished that 2 small children could live in such desperate circumstances for a long period of time, that we appeared before her as pairs of wild waifs. The very least she could do, she said, was to bring us this jar of honey. Others brought bread and barley, others fruit and sandwiches. Whatever people brought, we accepted it gladly. Truly, we were overwhelmed by the kindness of these good people, almost all of them Aryans who had been brainwashed by the Germans into believing that Jews were the lowest form of life. And yet here they were, trying to help. Two of my father's friends from his athletic club came by with whiskey and kielbasa's, which the adults consumed eagerly. Of course, we were careful not to eat or drink too much too quickly because our stomachs had been inactive for so long. Indeed, these treats and delicacies were a welcome kindness, but we longed for the simple diet we had left behind. We had been so long without a visit from Sosha and Wroblewski that we had barely eaten any of the basic staples over the past several days. We had not had any bread. Our soup had no ingredients but boiled water and maybe some onions. For 14 months we'd been undernourished, but for the past week we'd been starved. So we longed for just a bite of bread, a sip of coffee, a drink of water. The next day my father returned to the sewer with Sosha and Wroblewski to gather some of our left-behind provisions. If you had told my father he would be returning soon to his underground prison, he would not have believed it. But there was a good amount of food in the palace, which we now urgently needed. There were other items that could be of use above ground as well, such as pots and pans and the carbide lanterns that had been for so long our only source of light. So my father revisited our underground home to rummage through our few things, to see what food might be salvageable. It was a desperate measure, but we were certainly desperate, and we would remain so for some time. So that's the end of chapter 9. I'll read chapter 10 tomorrow.